Several years ago, I had the good fortune to meet a young lady who at the time was the director of the Museum. And I didn't want to go to the Museum because the Museum did not want me to be there. That's how I felt. But she was telling me about this new exhibit that they were unveiling at the Comer based on Lift Every Voice and Sing. They called the exhibit Lift. And it was an outstanding exhibit, and that started me understanding and appreciating and identifying with some of these talented and gifted artists, black and white artists, here in Jacksonville. So I'm going to call up Mrs. Hope McMath to do her thing and to introduce a guest that she has with her. Hope.
Good afternoon. It's hard to know on a day like today what I could possibly add to this mix, and probably the most important thing I'm going to add are the visual images that are going to be flipping through on the screen behind me. These are all works of art that were created by artists in our own community who were inspired by the courageous actions of a group of young people back in the summer of 1960. They also created works that connect that moment to today. You'll also get a little glimpse of a great art and social justice project that my good friend Shawana Brooks is doing through her 6 Feet Away gallery. So you'll see some of those pictures as well. I'm also here to offer up gratitude and a little bit of blunt talk. Gratitude is a bit tough these days, right? I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're watching brothers and sisters across the country deal with natural disasters and the constant daily drumbeat of racial terror in the streets of our city. But I'm grateful to be alive. But that also means that this is a moment of mourning. And it's that complex mix of appreciation and sorrow that seems appropriate for this day as we recognize the courage and inspiration of those who sat in, boycotted, demanded change, but that we also don't forget the violence that met them. I also stand here today very grateful for my relationship with Rodney Hurst. Our first couple times together were rough. They were real, and I'll never forget those moments. And since, I feel very grateful that he has become a mentor, teacher, supporter, constant critic, and friend. But I know I am glad to be living in a world where Mr. Hurst and Mr. Yates and Mrs. Marjorie Meeks Brown have walked. And I'll admit that for me, it took way too long to see and understand this history. I mean, I'm a native of Jacksonville. I grew up in Arlington, went to the public schools, was part of bus desegregation, a graduate of Terry Parker. But Axe Handle Saturday was not part of the history that I learned. So when did that begin for me? Did it begin when the Ritz Museum finally opened? Did it begin when I started to become obsessed with the work of Augusta Savage 23 years ago? Or maybe when I first read James Weldon Johnson's autobiography? All that's true, but really I think some of my deepest learning began when I became friends with Rodney Hurst. It's meant 5 years of lots of listening and learning. But here's the problem, and some of these comments are directed to my white brothers and sisters. We can't keep our nose in a book. If we wait until we think we are ready to fully engage in this fight, it will be too late. As we are learning, it's essential that we also recognize a sense of urgency in turning our knowledge into action. I mean, how should we address the fact that we live in a divided community where our mayor keeps saying, one city, one Jax? What role should I or any other white person play in the movement for racial justice? How do we respond when just even the name of our city, the names of our streets, our parks, our bridges, and our schools are steeped in racism? And how do we best shine a light on the black brilliance that is the history of this city? And maybe most importantly, how do we begin to dismantle the systems that white people put in place more than 400 years ago to prop up white supremacy? The how of it doesn't matter. It simply means we need to jump in and do it. And for white people, it is imperative, yes, to listen and learn, but we have to leave the sidelines. And we see that happening in our streets today. And we know it matters. From great people like Frederick Douglass and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, we know from their experiences that silence really does equal violence. It's a common thread in our histories. Harm is caused by the complicity of inaction. History teaches us it's important to stand up, speak out against injustice. We use words like solidarity, be an upstander, but what does that really mean? What it really means, what history shows us, is that it's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And we all want to see ourselves in that history, right? For me, Richard Parker and Reverend Charles McGee, who were both involved in the demonstrations in 1960s, are two white people in a long history of accomplices, from the abolitionists to the rabbis standing with Martin Luther King. But the problem is those examples will always be too few. I recently looked into my own family history. You know, I was one of those people that was absolutely determined to find somebody in my lineage who was some great liberator. You know, I was just sure of it. I was just sure that that was going to be there. And when I looked, it was a much different history. For many generations on my estranged father's family side, we were involved in the displacement of indigenous people. We fought for the Confederacy. We held elected offices in order to pass Jim Crow laws. And yes, my family owned people. 19 of them over the generations in North Georgia and a small town in Alabama. But James Baldwin reminded us any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it. And so standing in this park today with all of you, we can feel the energy of that disruption. Some of us have danced in this park after the Human Rights Ordinance finally was passed. Some of us stood here on behalf of immigrants in our community that were being attacked locally and nationally. Some of us stood in this park to take on a small-minded city council member that wanted to spend all his time censoring art. We've stood in this park and demanded that Confederate sculptures come down. We have marched in this park for community control of the police. And we have stood in this park and expressed our rage after the modern-day lynchings of Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and now today, Jacob Blake. This place, this day, gives us a space to recognize the progress that we've made, but to also see, really see, those eerie patterns of repetition. There are strong parallels between 1960 and 2020 and what we see playing out on the streets in Minneapolis, Portland, Atlanta, and now Kenosha. And we can't just blame one violent extremist with a gun, and we can't just blame one fool in the White House. We all have blood on our hands. Some of us, it's from blatant racism, but that's not really the biggest problem. Most of us don't know people walking around with KKK hoods anymore, though I know a few who have them in their closets. It's more insidious than that, right? Happens in C-suites, boardrooms, city hall, schools, neighborhoods, and homes. And it's our turn together to tear it out by the roots. And for my white brothers and sisters, this work is awkward and it's messy. We are likely to create harm while we are learning and doing. We will be tempted to cry big, salty tears of fragility. And we will want people to pay attention to how we hurt. We're gonna wring our hands and fret over what we should do. We're gonna demand that we get just the right book to tell us how to do this. And we're gonna form yet one more committee to take on the issue of racism. And then we're gonna spend a lot of time putting out corporate messages about how Black Lives Matter and not let it change the way we work one iota. So I started my remarks from a place of gratitude, and that is where I will end them. For those who sat in, they didn't do it just for themselves, they did it for all of us. For 60 years, some of those same people have stood up, marched on, walked out, taken a knee, not just for themselves, but for justice for all. So should we learn and listen? Of course. Should we mourn? We should. Should we vote? Absolutely. Should we question those in power? Every day. But each of us has the ability to reshape our culture from one of incredible inequity and division and apathy to one of shared power, compassion, equity, and love. And in the words of the great Rodney Hurst from his book, It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke, quote, "If Jacksonville is to reach a level of greatness, men and women of goodwill must continually attack racism at every level, and the consequences should not be a consideration." Thank you, Rodney. So it's now my pleasure to bring to the podium a remarkable poet and friend. Ebony Payne English is a poet, a performer, and an educator here in Jacksonville, Florida. She's an award-winning author who has a poetry collection, graphic novels, and has written the acclaimed play On Purpose. She's currently managing director of the Performers Academy, and she is one of our true cultural gems. So please welcome Ebony Payne English.